You want them to think about why it's so important that they keep their room clean and things like that. After a little while, you give up on that. You figure out they're never going to learn it this way. So then you say, because if you want to keep living in this house, you're going to clean your room. That's why. Right? Or something like that. And you teach them reason by doing because their little heads aren't capable of reasoning out big things like, bugs and disease and, you know, people walking in and why it is that you have a social responsibility or a social image that you need to maintain and all that kind of stuff, right? And that's why you want your house to have some curb appeal and you don't preferably put your old recliner out in your front yard, things like that because but eventually you kind of learn that, and you learn it by doing, right? We learn to think by doing. We learn even a lot of our reasoning skills around how things work come by drawing them out, and we learn that very young in life. And God pities us, and so He gives us these lessons like this, doing, and therefore learning about, and that the law could not teach us or rather, the law did not just teach us that we're failures. That wasn't the purpose of the law. The purpose of the law wasn't so that we would learn that we were unrighteous. It had that effect, and that is a truth. The law teaches us that we're unrighteous. But the purpose of the law was given to us that we might learn something. It is possible for us to be in the place that Paul was in, when he declares that as touching the righteousness that was in the law, he was blameless. The law was not completely without righteousness. It was simply first grade or kindergarten righteousness. A list of 10 things, for instance, 10 commandments. And these are not the ultimate measure of righteousness or the ultimate measure of holiness. This is kindergarten, primary level holiness. Almost anybody can do that. The 10 Commandments seem insurmountable in one way, but in reality, if you think about them, they're introductory level righteousness, but not even all that much righteousness. And in fact, we find out that the ultimate fulfillment of the law of righteousness is love, and that gets us everywhere. And we found out we can still learn some things from the law. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to learn some things from the law. And the thing we're going to learn about from the law today is about money. Only it isn't actually about money. But we always make it about money, and so we're going to do that today. And kind of by way of introduction, let's see. Oh, good. You don't know how unusual that is. I opened my wallet and there was money in it. I don't carry cash. It's so bulky, dirty. You know how many germs are on this thing? Anybody want to tell me what that is? Want to tell me what it's worth? No, it isn't. What's it worth? Come on, talk up. You have microphones, by the way. I mean, just in case anybody wants to, participate. You're going to have to use a microphone. Nobody can hear you, and I can't hear you either. It is indeed worth whatever we value it at. That was the answer. In fact, it's worth whatever you're willing to give me in exchange for this piece of paper. In the end, that's what it's worth. And whatever I trade this for is how much I valued this thing. Right? This is the reason why a hot dog that is literally like 25 cents worth of hot dog and bun and mustard and relish in the airport costs you $7.50. Let me tell you why that's the case. Because you're hungry, and the next thing you're going to get to eat is a dry bag of pretzels on a plane. So if you want something more substantial than that, then you're going to have to eat whatever's available. And what happens to be available, it's something cheap that they're going to charge you a lot of money for. $7.50 for a hot dog. People pay it all the time. Because at that moment, in that circumstance, that hot dog to them is worth $7.50. Now, you may not even like hot dogs, You may think that's kids' food. I don't eat that as an adult, right? It's like, that's not what I do. But if you're stuck in an airport and the only thing open is a hot dog stand, you're hungry, and it's $7.50, the hungrier you get, the closer the value of that hot dog gets to $7.50 until you're willing to pay it. Now, I think that's an important thing because it turns out that there's a lot in life that works that way. We exchange a lot of value in our lives. Time, um, even our bodies, our energy, trade out for something else in life. And what we trade it out for indicates a considerable amount of what we value it at. For instance, you can tell how much a man values his skull by the kind of motorcycle helmet he wears when he rides. And if he doesn't wear one, it's because he really doesn't think that much about his own intelligence and his own brain. You can tell a lot by that. And the same thing is true of all sorts of things like your time. How much is your time worth? Well, if you sit and watch a show on television for 3 hours, that is what you valued your time at. 3 hours of entertainment. Was it worth it? Well, at times it can be. Just exactly the same way that a hot dog that literally costs less than 25 cents in actual cost outlay, maybe even less than that when they buy them in bulk, you're willing to pay $7.50 for in the right circumstance. Same thing is true of watching a movie. It is possible that 3 hours of your time that you normally get paid $20 an hour for, $60. If you think about what's the actual cost of going to a movie, you think, well, it's $8 for the ticket and, $20 for a thing of popcorn. Have you ever thought out how much you pay for popcorn at a movie theater? It's incredible how much you pay for a popcorn. And how expensive is it to make popcorn at home? It's the cheapest thing you can make in your kitchen. But you pay a lot for it in the theater. And then you add to that the 3 hours of time at $20 an hour. And what was the actual value of that movie to you? Over $100. Really. But that's the truth. And that is why I think when it comes to this issue of giving, we very often don't think through it very clearly. Here's what we want. We want the least amount of pain possible when separating ourselves from one of these. That's what we want. We don't want it to hurt when we give money. But what I want to do today is go back to the law. Remember, this is the kindergarten version of everything that we find in the New Testament, we find under the law in the Old Testament. We're going to begin in Numbers chapter 3. And I want to establish a little bit of groundwork for what we're going to talk about. So let's look in Numbers chapter 3, verses 11 through 13. Then the Lord spake to Moses, saying, And I, behold, I have taken the Levites from among the children of Israel instead of all the firstborn that openeth the matrix among the children of Israel. Therefore, the Levites shall be mine, because all the firstborn are mine. For on the day that I smote all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, I hallowed unto me all the firstborn of Israel, both man and beast. Mine shall they be. I am the Lord. So let's look at that principle a little bit differently over in chapter 18 and verse 20. And the Lord spake unto Aaron, Thou shalt have no inheritance in their land, neither shalt thou have any part among them. I am thy part and thine inheritance among the children of Israel. And behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tenths in Israel, that is all the tithe in Israel, for an inheritance for their service which they serve, even the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. So let's see. If we started in chapter 3 and read all the way through chapter 18, this is a really good passage, and it's a great way to get your feet wet in this concept of tithing. And but I've selected kind of the beginning and the end of it here. We're going to put them together, and you go back and read the middle to see that I'm not out of context. But we're going to put them together here and see the reasoning that God had. Here was his reasoning. On the day that I smote all the firstborn of Israel, or of Egypt, I sanctified or made holy unto me all the firstborn in Israel, and you owe them to me, because I didn't kill them. I spared them, and therefore they're mine by right. But that's a little heavy for you. It would be really hard for every family in Israel to give their firstborn child to serve God. And so, in his pity on you, he said, I will take unto me one tribe. So, I'm going to take Levi. And then, because I have done this, and they're going to be serving me, and I am going to be their inheritance, they're not going to have land to plow. They're not going to have animals to husband. They're going to live, therefore, off of a tenth of everything else produced in the land, because that's how you're going to pay for their continual day and night service to me in the tabernacle. You're going to pay for it with this tithe, right? Now, I want you to understand that this is a tithe really of responsibility or obligation. That is, they are obliged, they have a responsibility to pay this 10%, and they have a responsibility to pay this 10% because God did not claim their firstborn. And he didn't claim their firstborn lamb, he didn't claim their firstborn of every ewe, and he didn't claim the firstborn calf of every cow, and he didn't claim the firstborn of every animal that they had in all their flocks. He didn't claim that. So instead, he claimed 1/10 of all their increase. Whatever that increase was, they owed 1/10 of it to God for the service of the Levites. Now, he refers to this later on. We won't go there. This is a long conversation he has with the Israelites over centuries, this issue of tithing. And he addresses it multiple times throughout the Pentateuch and the minor prophets. But in another place, he says, bring the tithes into the storehouse. And this is often taught kind of by modern evangelicals as the church is the storehouse, and we should bring the tithe into the church because the church is now the storehouse. Well, if that's the case, then we would have to have pastors who lived like Levites did. Serve the Lord continually, didn't work somewhere else, and they would have this promise that their income would increase as the blessing of God increased on the people, because that's what the Levites had. The more that the people of Israel, the children of Israel, were blessed, the greater the income of the Levites. It was a monetary or a benefit for them to be holy and to lead the children of Israel in holiness, because God promised that he would bless the children of Israel as they drew closer and closer to him. The more they obeyed and drew close to God, the more wealthy the land would become, the more wealthy the Levites would become. It was a great system, except it never worked. It just doesn't seem to be a good functioning system from a human perspective. If you've ever studied much in business management, you would have come across a psychological tool referred to as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And and by the way, this was done by Abraham Maslow, a Jewish research psychologist. And one of the interesting things that he notes is that money tends to be a very low significance motivator. Isn't that interesting? People are not well motivated by money. Ask Michael. He'll tell you. They're not well motivated by money. He's got employees, and he tells them, look, I will pay you double time to work on Saturday and get this job done. No, Friday night I'm off at 4 or 2 or whatever it is they want to leave at. They don't want to stay to get the extra double time. No. Why? Because the money isn't that great a motivator. And it turns out that Israel had a problem with this, and I think you and I do too. If we were to look at this tithe and think of ourselves right now, how would we make the application of this tithe to us? Which clearly, we couldn't clearly make a parallel. There's no clear direct parallel with the priests of the Old Testament, with the Levites of the Old Testament, and the church of the New Testament, right? Because our pastors are not like the Levites. We don't have, you don't bring me meat. You don't bring me vegetables. You don't bring me bread. You don't bring me, if the pastors of the New Testament were like the Levites of the Old Testament, every bit of increase that came in your life, you would give 10% of to, but it wouldn't go to paying the bills of the church. It wouldn't go to paying the electricity. That would be something beyond that. But it would go to the pastors for their income, if we were a parallel of them. But if we were to try to make this by application, here's what we would say. There is some form of giving that is related to responsibility, not any other reason, except that you're responsible for doing it. We're going to see that in the New Testament, Paul addresses all three of these principles: responsibility, fulfillment, and sharing. All three of these. So that's the first one. And I say that it's impossible for us to actually do that now because we actually aren't set up like Israel was. It never really worked well for Israel. They were constantly not accomplishing this simple thing. And if they were, it would have been a completely different history than what was written in Scripture. Furthermore, I have this other little point, and it's only a tiny point, but I just thought I'd bring it out to you. Let's say a church had only one pastor, and everyone in that church very faithfully tithed of their gross income to that pastor, and he got every penny of that tithe. He would make a certain level of income, and that certain level of income, the more people that are in the church, approaches an interesting mathematical value called the median. The median is the value directly in the center between the lowest and the highest. So if a pastor got a tenth from everybody in the church, as the number of people in the church approaches, number of income earners in the church approaches 100, we might think of that like 100 families. As it approaches 100 families in the church, that pastor's income actually approaches the median value, the spot exactly between the lowest income earner in the church and the highest income earner in the church. Isn't that interesting? Never more than that. Or not unless you get extreme numbers. The more extreme numbers, you get more value. But it approaches that. So that as the church and the pastorate grows to scales proportionally to meet the needs, the pastors would never be the richest people in the church, but they would never be the poorest people in the church either. They'd be right in the median where everybody needs to be. And if you thought about the Levites, what a great way for the Lord to do it. Again, it never quite worked that way for them. But we're not done yet. Let's keep going in the law, and I'll show you why nobody actually teaches Old Testament tithing. Go to Deuteronomy 14. This is one of the reasons I don't believe in Old Testament tithing, because nobody actually teaches it. I have never heard anyone teach Old Testament tithing in its fullness. And here's why. Deuteronomy 14, beginning in verse 22. Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed that the field bringeth forth year by year. Now, that statement alone separates this from the tithe to support the Levites, because this is a tithe that doesn't include any animals. This is only vegetables, things that grow in the field. He says, you're going to do this. Everything the field bringeth forth year by year, and thou shalt eat it before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of thy corn and of thy wine and of thy oil and the firstlings of the herds of the flocks. Oh, there's the meat. And thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always. And if the way be too long for thee, so that thou art not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there, when the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, then thou shalt turn it into money, and bind it up in thine hand, and shalt go to the place which the Lord thy God shall choose, and thou shalt bestow that money for the support of the church. No, thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after. A new iPad. For oxen, for sheep, for wine, and in case you are a teetotaler, for strong drink. Can you believe the Lord actually put that in there? This is why nobody actually teaches real tithing from the Old Testament. Because this is a really strange one to teach, isn't it? Let's see if we can break this out into sort of modern English. Every year, set aside 10% and throw a party before the Lord. Whatever you want. I'm talking about barbecue brisket and corn and I want you to eat that entire 10%, consume it before God. Do you know how much food you could eat with 10% of your income right now? Do you have any idea how fat you would get if you spent 10% of your income on food and ate it all at one time before the Lord? This is why nobody teaches tithing. By the way, this was done so that you might learn to fear him. Because when you connect directly, the most significant part of your limbic system, your belly, your taste buds, with the one who provided that blessing, a little connection is formed from your body, through your brain, to your hand, that teaches you that I have a lot of things that came to me from God. If I'm not careful, I could lose that blessing. It connects literally the way you think about planting your seed and watering it and growing, and it makes you consider it on a completely different level because now you're considering the one who's going to bless this thing and honoring him so that this is a huge thing that you consume before him. You see? It's done so that you could fear him. Let's see. And thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household. There it is. So you thought tithing was 10%, and it is. The tithe to support the Levites was 10%, but there was another tithe which was meant to be taken and consumed before God by everyone in the nation every single year. So if you're tithing, you're cheap. Because if you really wanted to teach tithing, it's at least 20%. And I actually think it's a little more than that. And let me tell you why. Now, there's some debate on this, and you can read different commentators and different scholars. I read a ton of their arguments on both sides. One that says there's actually only 2 tithes, and the other argument says there's 3. I actually think there's 3 tithes. And the third one comes next. Here it is, verse 27. And the Levite that is within thy gates, thou shalt not forsake him, for he hath no part nor inheritance with thee. At the end of 3 years, thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shall lay it up within thine gates. Now, this isn't the one you take to Jerusalem. It's not the one you pay the Levites for their continual work in the temple. This is a different thing. Every 3 years, you're going to take this thing and you are going to do something special with it. Here's what you're going to do with it. And the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the works which thy hand doest. So the first one, tithe, supports the Levites, which relieves you of the responsibility, the obligation to provide your firstborn of everything you have to the Lord. And in order to relieve you of that obligation, he charges you 1/10 of all your increase. Then, on top of that, there is another tithe, 1/10 of your increase, that now has to be taken to Jerusalem and consumed in joy before God, so that you might connect your limbic system with your spiritual mindset and learn to live in every sense of your body before the Lord, in everything you do, and learn to fear him. Then there is yet another one which is gathered once every 3 years, on the third year, every third year, and it is to create a magnificent banquet for the fatherless and the widow and the stranger and the Levite within the gates of your own city, to take care of your own community, to provide them with food that they might eat. And that's why I said nobody teaches tithing. Not like we'd actually find under the law. Because if they did, it wouldn't be 10%. It would be 10% for the church, 10% that you would consume before God, and another 10% once every 3 years that you would give to the poor and the servants within your city. If we were trying to draw a parallel, we might think of, civil servants or firemen and policemen or something like that, and we might think of the poor in our community, and we would give that 10% to them. So it could be, if you see this as 3 tithes, that in the third year, 30% of your income went out to the Lord, if you really taught tithing according to the law. So now let's look over in 2 Corinthians. We'll begin in chapter 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And in chapter 8 and chapter 9, there are 2 verses of the Old Testament directly quoted in chapter 8 and chapter 9, and he's dealing with Christian giving in these 2 chapters. And relative to Christian giving, you would imagine he would go back to the tithe and would teach the tithe in Christian giving in chapter 8 and chapter 9, but he doesn't. Not one reference that he gives references back to the tithe in the Old Testament. But he references all 3 of those principles. All 3 of them are here. So let's see. Chapter 8, verse 1. Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit, don't you just love some of those old ways of thinking? Anybody got an idea what he's saying there? Translate that for me into a more contemporary English. Anybody got? Pull up a microphone. We got plenty of them around. Wave it in the air so he can see which one it is. Yeah, go ahead. It's red over here. Dark red.
We want you to know?
We want you to know. We do you to it. We want you to think about this. We want you to know this, right? We want to bring this to your mind, all right? Of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, it might behoove us for a minute to talk about that word grace there for a minute. Because that word has both very broad application and some very specific applications. And this is one of the very specific ones, in which case it means a gift that God has given to them, to the Macedonians. The grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, how that in great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. Well, big words there. Let's see if we can't paraphrase that just a little bit. You know how your Macedonian brethren are. They are very poor and they are being persecuted right now. Nevertheless, somehow, the joy of their salvation and the trouble of their poverty and persecution work together in their heart to loosen the purse strings and make them want to give to the ministry. For to their power I bear record, and yea, beyond their power. That is, he's actually saying they could have given, they could have stuck to some level like a tithe and said, yes, I'm able to give that. But he said, but beyond what they were able to do, they went beyond what they were able to do and did what actually added to their pain. Praying us, it says, beyond their power, they were willing of themselves, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. And this they did not as we had hoped, but first gave their own selves to the Lord, and then unto us by the will of God. Now, isn't this an interesting passage? Just kind of backing up a little bit, thinking about what he wrote in 1 Corinthians and what he's written so far in 2 Corinthians. Isn't this an interesting passage? Because it feels like he's not the Paul who's saying, you got it wrong, and let me tell you how to get it right, which is 1 Corinthians. And he's not the Paul that says, look, we've been through a great trial of affliction, and we have proven ourselves to be the faithful sons of God. And you need to understand that we're doing this for your sake, and that God has, because of this, committed to you a ministry of your own, the ministry of reconciliation. This seems to kind of leave all of the theological statements and drops down to a level of instruction by way of illustration. He's pointing to someone and say, I want you to notice about them now. Notice the features that they have. Kind of like, the model walks out on the runway and says, she's wearing a long satin, with a collar, and notice the ruffles and all that kind of stuff, right? And then she walks off the stage. This seems like what Paul is doing here. Well, he's pointing to the Macedonians, and he's pointing out their features as they parade across the stage of the mind of his audience in Corinth. And he says, this is what they did. They refused to be limited by their situation and decided that even if it hurt them a little bit, even if they had to sacrifice more in the midst of their trials and afflictions, they were going to have a part in this ministering to other people thing. And they were not going to be satisfied with other people ministering to them or with God just preserving them through their trials and afflictions. They were determined that they were going to have a part in this thing of ministering to other people, so that when we thought, they should probably have a little bit that they can give, they first gave themselves to God, and then they gave themselves to us, which is a reference back to when he said, with much entreaty, they came to us and said, you gotta let us do this. No, you guys shouldn't do that because you're suffering badly right now. You don't even know that you're going to have food next week. I don't care. You got to let us have a chance in this ministry. This is the picture he's painting of the Macedonians. Insomuch, verse 6, that we desired Titus, that as he had begun, so he would finish also the same grace in you. And now he's turning away from the illustration and making application and saying, Titus now, who we left behind, and he's been ministering among you, Titus is there to make sure you have the same gift from God. The ability to give money, the ability to give at all, is a gift from God, a grace, right? Verse 7, therefore, as you abound in everything, all those things. Verse 8, I speak not by commandment, but by occasion of the forwardness of others, and to prove the sincerity of your love. For ye know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that ye through his poverty might be rich. Notice what he just did. He has now connected to their responsibility. And he's telling them, you guys should be giving because you know this is true. That Jesus had all the wealth of heaven, but took on him the form of a servant, became impoverished on the earth for your sake, that you might inherit all the wealth of heaven. And look how much wealth you have. You have a responsibility, according to the grace that God has shown to you, that you should be able to give likewise to other people. And if you can't, there's something wrong with this. This is the implication he's behind what he's saying. He's saying, if you see this, notice what the Macedonians did. They saw this, even in the midst of their persecution and trials and afflictions. You who are not in the midst of persecution, trial, and affliction, but are sitting in the lap of luxury, you know this grace of Jesus Christ just as well as they do. So something ought to happen in your heart. Then he gives them some advice. And we go down to verse 12. For if there be first a willing mind, it is accepted according to the man that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not. Another good old English way of saying it. Let's see what we're saying. Let's see what he said. Let's paraphrase it a little bit. He said, look, this is how the Lord wants to see it. He wants to see that you're not doing this out of obligation, but out of a willing mind. Either way, God has never expected you to give what he didn't give to you to give. He's always expected you to give out of your increase. Now, the Macedonians didn't give out of their increase. Theirs was decreasing and they still gave. But what God is really asking of you is that you have a willing heart and give out of what you actually do have right now. Not what you might get next month or next year, but what you do have right now. Then he says, beginning down to the first quote, for I mean not that other men be eased and ye be burdened, but by an equality that now at this time your abundance may be a supply for their want, that their abundance may be a supply for your want, that there may be an equality. And here is the quote from the Old Testament. As it is written, he that hath gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. Anybody want to tell me what that's a reference to in the Old Testament? Don't look at the passage. I don't care about the book. What incident was it of? Yes, the red over here.
It was when they were supposed to take manna they were supposed to only take what they needed and not too much.
Yes, this is a reference to manna. That's correct. Not to the Levites, not to all the rest. It was a reference. Oddly, it's kind of odd to me that he doesn't quote the Levites or the tithe when he's talking about giving. Instead, he looks at manna. Now, there's a whole lesson there we could go through. We don't have time today. We'll make a couple observations. Observation number one, manna lasted a short time and it was gone. It would go bad. So you had to gather and eat right away. Money is the same way. If you don't think it has wings, then you haven't had very much. And if money has wings, it sprouts them in the middle of the night when you're asleep. It's the other way with coat hangers, right? Which you put 3 coat hangers in your closet, a month later there'll be 30 of them, right? They multiply at night. Money's exactly the opposite. Money runs away at night. When you're not looking at it, it runs away. Like manna. Sprouts, worms, goes bad. And therefore, one might want to be really careful that we don't think about giving as something we will do one day when we reach a certain point in life, but as something we do now with what we have available, trusting that God is going to meet our need tomorrow. Now, don't go overboard, and he isn't asking you to. He's not saying, well, I have $10,000 in my bank account today, and it's what I have. I guess I'm going to give that. He's not saying give away your retirement. It has never been about, becoming impoverished yourself. It has been about taking a portion of what you have and giving that and trusting God to meet your needs tomorrow. Not the whole thing. It was never the whole thing. If you see tithing in the Old Testament the way I do, it's at least 20%, and it might be more if it's 3 tithes. In the 3rd year, it's 30%. But that was never everything. But it was a commitment. And so he first speaks about responsibility, and then he starts in the next set of verses in verse 16. But thanks be to God, which put the same earnest care in the heart of Titus for you. In other words, we sent Titus because he saw this, and he wanted you to have the same blessing that the Macedonians did. So, when I'm teaching you about giving today, I have no interest in my income rising. I have a great interest in you reaching a level of happiness that you don't know yet, or maybe you don't know yet. In fact, if I were to look at the church books, I would say you don't know anything about it yet. And it's not because I don't think you've given to the point where you hurt and then give a little more. That's an interesting cliche, but that's not even what he's saying here. He's saying there's a blessing that you could enter into, and you haven't. There's a gift that God has for you, and you haven't touched it. All right, let's keep going. Fulfillment. Drop down to chapter 9 and verse 6. But I say this, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man, according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. Remember that whole second tithe that you were supposed to eat before the Lord in joy and rejoicing before him? Because God wanted you to connect your viscera, your tricky limbic system, with the blessing that God has. And Paul here is saying exactly the same thing. He's saying, God actually wants you to have a joy. And he wants this joy to come to you in a way that connects you with other people. And that's by giving. Now, I know America's very different in a lot of ways. It's kind of odd. We're an odd jewel in all of history because we live in very sparsely separated homes. We don't entertain strangers very well at all. Somebody knocks on my door, I want them to go away now. I don't want to even answer the door. I want a remote control robot that says, who are you and what do you want? And then no matter what answer they give, I don't want it go away. Right? I mean, that's almost what I want, right? I want my house to automatically send visitors away without, oh, maybe that's a little extreme, but you get the point. We don't like people knocking on our doors. That's why door knocking for evangelism has become very ineffective in the last few years, the last couple decades. Because people don't, there was a time when the Fuller Brush Man came and that ding dong, Avon calling, all that kind of stuff. There were door to door everything for decades in America. Now we don't want that. Now most of our neighborhoods are no solicitation neighborhoods. But that's unusual. In fact, there was a time when if you had a cabin in the woods, in fact, in Alaska, it's still that way. If you have a cabin in the woods, you leave it unlocked. In case somebody's freezing to death out there in the woods, they can come in and warm up in your cabin. You do it as a service to the community, even though it's a very sparse community. But you wouldn't do that in San Antonio. You'd come home and find nothing. Even the furnace would be gone. But he's telling you here, God actually wants you to get cheer by giving. He's got a plan for you, a grace, a gift for you of happiness and joy that comes only from this form of happiness. It's not the only one, but this form of happiness comes from giving. Verse 8. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that ye always, having all sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work. God's able to make sure you don't fall behind in anything. The last part, sharing. Here's the next verse that he quotes. As it is written, he hath dispersed abroad, he hath given to the poor, his righteousness remaineth forever. Interesting way to teach giving, isn't it? Let's see if we can unravel this way of teaching giving for a minute. Can anybody tell me what he means by quoting that verse here? What's he trying to teach us by that verse? Did anybody ever teach you this verse when they taught giving? No, probably not. And that's why we don't know what it means. Anybody got an idea? Excuse me. It's not COVID. How about this? I could live my life with all my own money, doing all the things that I want to do, and I could be happy. And when I die, that's the end of all my works. And I go to the grave, and that's it. And if I built buildings and put my name on them, they might live for 100 or 200 years or something like that for a little while. People might remember, oh, that's the old Kresge building. Or that's the old Woolworth building. But it's not very long before they lose the connection between me and that building. Do you know who built the Empire State Building? Anybody know? General Motors. Who cares? Who even remembers? People tour the Empire State Building. Some of you may even have gone up to New York to see the church and toured up there and toured the Empire State Building. Still didn't know who built the thing. All of those kind of works pass away. But there is an interesting kind of work that has an eternal value. And that is the work that we invest in souls. Somebody comes into this church and they are fighting a losing battle in life. And they find in us strength and encouragement and eventually the very power of God itself, which is the gospel, which is the power of God. And they find the power of God and it changes them for eternity. That work is never going to pass away, even if that person dies. That work is an eternal work you just did. So let's see if we can see what he's saying here. It is possible to take something as meaningless and worthless as this piece of paper, or cloth, if you want to call it that, this thing, and translate it into eternity. So that you give a gift, you share money, and it becomes eternal righteousness. Verse 10, now he that ministereth seed to the sower, both ministereth bread for your food, and multiply your seed sown, and increase the fruit of your righteousness. That's all, by the way, the verse quoted, and that one is all a parenthetic statement. So if we went back to verse 8, and God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that ye always, having all sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work. And then we picked up that thought in verse 11, being enriched in everything to all bountifulness, which causeth through us thanksgiving to God. We take this and we turn it into praise for God. For the administration of this service not only supplieth the want of the saints, but is abundant also by many thanksgivings unto God, whiles by the experiment of this ministration, that is, the actual carrying out of this ministration, this ministry of giving, by the giving of this money to other people, by the purposeful setting out to convert what God has given you into something of eternal value, by that thing, right? They glorify God for your professed subjection to the gospel of Christ and your liberal distribution to them and to all men. Somebody, somewhere, one day, gave money at a church that supported a Christian serviceman center. In supporting the men who ran that center and purchasing the literature of printed tracts, somebody, somewhere, received one of those tracts and despised it and threw it on the ground. And in a moment of deep discouragement, with 2 flat tires on my bicycle, walking across a field, that little piece of trash caught my eye. And I went down to that Christian Serviceman Center. And as a result, my life has never been the same. And what you see standing before you today is the result of money somebody gave one time, long time ago. That's why verse 15, in context, if you take this out of context, everybody wants to say this is Jesus Christ. In a manner of speaking, it is. But he's talking about a particular aspect of Jesus Christ that is the body of Christ, that is adding to it and growing the body of Christ by this thing of giving. And then he says, thanks be unto God for his unspeakable gift. Do you know how indescribable the gift is that God has given us? That we can take this kind of garbage and turn it into eternal rewards. There's a crying shame that we're in this building. We don't have a sign on the street. People can hardly find us. We have to tell them the name of a cafe or another church for them to find us. That is a crying shame. It's even a worse shame that we have to keep changing the address on all of our printed material because we don't know where we're going to be. It is terrible that a group this size doesn't have its own building and a way to draw people in on a regular basis. And as a result, we have very few visitors on a regular basis. It's a terrible shame that that is true. And it is because we have not really gotten the lessons that we should have gotten from the Old Testament. So here's what you should do. You should go back and learn the lesson of the tithe. Because you got to learn the reason by doing. Start with 10% and set it out and say, I am going to do this. 10% is going to go to God. That way, just like taking the kid's hand, wrapping it around the block and say, pick up the block, put it in the basket. Now you do the next one by yourself. Until they can do it. You take their hand in the little pen, you say, that's a letter A. Now do it yourself. Let me see you do it. No, not quite yet. Let me try it again. That's a letter A. Then they get it. Eventually, they learn what the letter A means and all the different sounds it can make and all the different words you could put it in. But they have to start out by drawing like this. That's what you need to do. And I think if you start out with 10%, you are cheap beyond all belief and you are cutting yourself off at the knees. And you ought to make it 20%. And you ought to think about how you could take 10% of your income. Think about it for yourself for a minute. Take 10% of your income and figure out what you could do for God with 10% of your income. How many stamps could you buy that you could write handwritten letters to people you know, inviting them to church and inviting them to come to Christ and put it in an envelope and send it off? What could you do if you spent 10% of your income on your own ministry besides what you give to the church? I think you ought to do it. I think the problem is you don't believe it. You don't believe God's going to keep meeting your needs and keep blessing you so that you can keep doing that. And if you did, you'd take a different view of giving than what you do right now. And a church this size would be in its own building in a year. Let's close in a word of prayer. We're over time. Thank you, Lord, for this time we've had together this morning. We've covered a lot of ground in just a little short time. We've missed a lot of things along the way. Lord, I pray that you, by the power of your Holy Spirit, would help us to think through these things, see them and apply them to ourselves as never before, that we might have more joy in our hearts than we've ever had before, seeing souls saved, lives changed, and money converted to eternal value. And we ask it in Jesus' name.